Is Russia getting desperate over Ukraine? Where could that lead, and what should the U.S. do? Here at home, what in the world did PayPal think it was doing when it announced financial penalties for its users who went public with political opinions that PayPal didn't like? And what did Vice President Kamala Harris mean when she said that disaster relief after Hurricane Ian should be allocated according to principles of racial equity? We will discuss these issues and so much more on today's episode of Independent Outlook. Hello, everybody. I'm Graham Walker, coming to you today from the Independent Institute in Oakland, California, right across the bay from San Francisco. We try and bring you an independent take on the issues of our day. And as always, I am joined by my colleague and friend, Williamson Evers, who is the Senior Fellow here and Director of our Center on Educational Excellence. Hello, Bill Evers.
Hello, Graham.
Great to see you. And also, so happy that we're joined today again by our colleague, Ivan Eland. Ivan Eland is a Senior Fellow here at the Independent Institute, also Director of our Center on Peace and Liberty. Ivan Eland is the author of a number of books, among them War and the Rogue Presidency, highly relevant for today's issues, a book called 11 Presidents. I like this one especially, Ivan, Recarving Rushmore, ranking the presidents on peace, prosperity, and liberty, a perennial favorite. You may have seen Ivan on TV. He's been on ABC World News Tonight, CNN. You may have read him in USA Today and elsewhere. Welcome to Ivan Eland.
Thanks.
So great to have you. So, Ivan, somebody, who knows who, dropped explosives on the vehicle bridge connecting Russia and Crimea, and this triggered a massive and apparently escalating indiscriminate series of attacks by Russia throughout Ukraine. What should we make of all this? First of all, why hasn't Ukraine claimed credit for the explosion on the bridge? It was a pretty important strategic victory, blocking off supply lines. They didn't really claim credit, did they?
No, they haven't, and it's probably because they don't want to poke the beast any more than they've already done. They enjoy poking and mocking the beast, but I think they're if they're too blatant. I think they might as well just take credit for it since it's obvious that they did it. But diplomats take over or whatever, and they seem to think they get some advantage by not admitting it. But because there is some civilian traffic that goes across the bridge, so they don't want to be labeled as they may be looking to not be charged for war crimes or something. Although it's a military target because Russia is resupplying the forces in southern Ukraine across this bridge. So it would be a collateral hit on any civilians that were on the bridge. So there's really, I don't think any real reason for them not to do that. But for some reason they're not claiming it. But anyway, the retaliatory.
They're getting punished as if they had done it, right?
Yes, right. They're getting all the negative. Yes. Then
Also,
Russia, that's all Russia has now is just wailing away on civilian targets because they don't really have their military's in disarray. It hasn't broken yet, but it's in disarray at this point.
Mm-hmm.
Also,
Bill,
the
you were going
Russians
to comment.
Yes, the Russian secret police, the FSB, has arrested 8 people, 5 for the truck. What they're saying is a truck bombing. There's some dispute about actually how the bridge was blown up, whether it might have been a missile or something triggered from a ship passing nearby below, and all sorts of speculative things. But anyway, the Russians are saying it was a truck bomb, which is a little confusing since it seems like it blew up in 2 different places and so forth. But anyway, that's what they're saying. And 5 of the people arrested were Russians. Now, there may have been casualties in the bombing. In other words, if it was a truck bomb, the bombers or the delivery people may have been blown up. But anyway, that's what the Russians are saying, I think.
So it seems like a massive...
the Nord Stream. We have also mysteries connected.
Well, I think
to
the Nord Stream pipeline is a bit different. Nobody really knows for sure who did that, but it's very interesting that the U.S. Took a long time to chastise the Ukrainians for assassinating, apparently by mistake, the nationalist Russian's daughter, but they did so after the Nord Stream bombing. So it could have been that the Ukrainians did the Nord Stream bombing to cut the European dependence on Russian oil. But it's also possible the Russians did it themselves. That's a little more murkier, I would say. Certainly the pictures of the bridge they had, the explosion seemed to be, if they had blown it under the bridge, you wouldn't have seen as much fire. They could have done the bridge up below the bridge and above the bridge at the same time, but there was certainly a charge on top of the bridge because the explosion was, you could see it very well on the camera.
I might mention that Tucker Carlson and the former foreign minister of Poland have both suggested that the United States Secret Services blew up the Nord Stream pipeline. So, and of course, Biden did say some months ago that if Russia attacks, the Nord Stream pipeline will be stopped. I'm leaning with the people, the dominant belief that Russia did it, possibly just to show that they could disrupt to show they have a multi-directional form of warfare that they're using to threaten even the pipeline between Scandinavia and Poland, and just in general bedevil Europe. But it could have been a number of players.
Yeah, I think it's hard to say, but it certainly is. It's going to take a long time to fix. So they're going to have, the supplies are going to be even. It wasn't really. It's symbolic because it wasn't really. The Nord Stream 2 is not ready yet, and the Nord Stream 1 was basically shut down anyway. So I'm not sure it's going to affect the gas market in reality in Europe.
So, Ivan, you're the strategic expert on these matters in some ways. It would seem as the Russians sort of flail in response to the attack on the bridge, they are striking out ferociously, and yet unable to hold on to or recover or keep the territory that they previously had gotten. The Ukrainians seem to be gaining on the ground. A lot of people are arguing that this is the moment for the West generally and the United States in particular to double down on its support of and provision of weaponry for the Ukrainians to drive the Russians back and to finally put them in their place. Is that the right strategy, Ivan?
Well, I don't know if it's the right strategy, but I think that's what's going to happen because Biden is under some, and the other NATO countries are, when you're winning, you naturally throw more money into the pot, right? And you may not and ultimately win, but you're certainly winning at the time. So you throw a lot of resources. And now, of course, there is some trepidation about Putin using a tactical nuclear weapon on the battlefield. That's a battlefield weapon. It's smaller than the big strategic weapons that would fly over in any sort of, nuclear Armageddon. But even that is very potent as far as, weapons go. But there's really not much military advantage for him to do that on the battlefield at this point. And it's more of a shock factor, because if he does one and that doesn't stop it's not going to stop the Ukrainians, then he's going to have to use more, and that would probably trigger a NATO conventional attack right there. So there's danger of escalation, and there's also a danger that these air defense systems that they're now sending, and they were sending them these Stinger handheld. There are little tube pipes that you put on your shoulder. One guy can fire them, and they're effective for low flying aircraft. But they're now sending them, Iris-T from Germany, and the new system that the U.S. has, and the danger of course, it was at the same danger that we faced during World War II before when the Japanese bombed Pearl Harbor. People were saying, well, we've been giving all this material to the Soviets and the British who are under attack from, Hitler, but now we've got a war. So then it becomes, do we use our stocks to give them these sophisticated air defense systems that can impair your your ability to fight. Although we're in much better shape than we were, in Pearl Harbor. But that's a question. How much do you give Ukraine and deplete your own stocks?
Well, Ivan.
So I wonder, Ivan, if you saw Tom Friedman's column in the New York Times, where he says that, yes, the U.S. is at war now with China and Russia simultaneously.
Yes, and I think that's if you pull back and look at the bigger picture, you don't really want that. Remember Kissinger in the early 70s was very shrewd in opening to China so he could use it as a lever against the Soviet Union. And of course, he had got détente with the Soviet Union arms control agreements because the Soviets said, hey, don't overlook us for this détente. We want it. Mao gets it. We want it too. And so he drove a wedge between the communist powers at the time. And that's what I advocated up until the invasion, because I thought, geostrategically, we should have probably made nice with Putin before he did this. And I think it's the underlying problem here is it's not all Putin's fault. I'm not certainly excusing what he's doing, invading another country and then rather brutally killing civilians. I'm not in any way excusing that, but I think we have to look at, we always tend to forget the stuff that our side does that might make the other side a little nervous. And expanding NATO since the time of Clinton through, right up to Biden's term when he reiterated our desire to take Ukraine into NATO, which George W. Bush had really started in 2008, which was a major blunder. But then Biden recently redoubled it.
Right.
I think that had, over long term, it's had an effect on not only humiliating Putin, who's a nationalist, but in fact getting Putin to power in the first place, because they might not have brought Putin to that nationalism to power if NATO had not been pushing east. So I think it's possible to hold two thoughts in your mind at the same time. One is that we probably shouldn't have expanded NATO right up to Russia's borders, especially through Poland. Poland and Ukraine are the invasion route into Russia, and Russia's been invaded many times by the Swedes, by the Poles, by the French, Napoleon, and 2 times by the Germans. The last one killing 25 million Russians and trashing Western Russia in the greatest mortal combat in the history of the world during World War II. So, Russia has a very poor security from the West, unlike we have the advantage here that have great intrinsic security with 2 oceans, weak neighbors, and friendly neighbors. And then we have a very potent nuclear arsenal as well. But the Russians aren't so gifted geographically. So they're going to have legitimate security interests. And I think we've been really abysmal in that approaching it that way.
One thing I think both of you could comment on is if I'm looking at the situation right now, in simple terms, it would seem the argument might be that if the U.S. and the Western forces just keep rearming Ukraine to the max as far as they can go, and Ukraine holds territory and takes back more and so forth, that Putin and those around him, they'll finally be forced to admit that Ukraine really doesn't mean that much to them after all, and they can relinquish it.
Well,
is that a realistic expectation? No, probably not. A lot of them are escaping the country. Your answer is helpful. Specifically, I think you confirm my suspicion that it would probably be a mistake to say the Russians will finally be forced to admit that Ukraine doesn't mean that much to them. That sounds unlikely.
It's unlikely. I think everything that Ivan has said makes a lot of sense. The Russians, if you poll elite opinion in Russia, we have such polls, you can see that opinion thinks that Ukraine has to be either neutrally pro or accommodating to Russia or part of Russia. And that's not going to change. I mean, even if the Russians get totally whipped militarily, future Russian governments, whether they're Putin or somebody else, are still going to have this attitude. And this is what the realist analysis that Ivan was stressing is that, it's sort of inserted into the underbelly of the country of Ukraine, is inserted into the underbelly of Russia. So they're going to be worried about it.
I wanted to point out I wanted to point out that Bill Evers has provided quite a background compilation of information on the subject. I'm just sharing quickly the screen from our website, independent.org. You can go to recommended readings. Can you tell us briefly what people can find here, Bill, if they go to this reading list that you created?
Well, it's a list of books and articles. They pertain to the history and the lead up to fighting both in 2014 and to this year, 2022, between Russia and Ukraine. It discusses this realistic analysis of the geopolitics of it. It discusses Putin's own personal background and history. It discusses classical liberalism, the classical liberal political movements in both Ukraine and Russia, and particularly in Russia, at two various important points after the February 1917 revolution, and then during the Gaidar years, Gaidar and Yeltsin years, was when decommunization was going on. The classical liberals were very important, but they didn't succeed. And so some of that's in there. There's some cultural things about Turgenev and a variety of Dostoevsky on sort of the opposite literary pole and cultural pole. So there's a lot of interesting stuff in there. What did Russia, how did the Tatars, the Mongols, how did that affect? What about the Cossacks? How did that affect Ukraine? And so forth. So there's a lot of interesting
good stuff. Yeah.
Civilizational material in here, as well as strategic things.
So I definitely invite people to go to Independent.
The annotations are a good guide as to what you're going to find in the book or article, and you can just even learn a lot from just reading the annotations without getting into the book or the article.
So I do invite people to go to our website, independent.org. Under issues, you'll find recommended readings, very much worth consulting. If you don't mind, gentlemen, I'm going to turn the page back to some domestic concerns. I invite Ivan to stay with us while I introduce our next guest who's going to join us. Welcome to Jeffrey Tucker. Hey, Jeffrey.
Well, it's nice to see you. Thank you.
It's great to see you. Many people will recognize Jeffrey Tucker. He is the founder and president of the Brownstone Institute, a new research and think tank organization that's making quite an impact. You're the author of 10 books, most recently, I guess, Liberty or Lockdown, thousands of articles. And you have, what is it now, a daily column in the Epoch Times?
I write for the Epoch Times every day, which is, something that's a real pleasure for me because I've always wanted to have some kind of relationship with a major newspaper. It's the fourth largest. And so they've never censored me. I write there every single day about basically whatever I want to. So it's a good life.
So one of the things you wrote about was this amazing story regarding PayPal. I'm just going to show people, we've reposted the article to our website, independent.org. The PayPal fiasco was no accident. You can find some more details from Jeffrey Tucker there. But the thing is, Jeffrey, I was just stunned. I mean, tell me if I've got this right or wrong, but am I right that PayPal announced a policy change whereby its users who used the site to do payment transactions were put on notice that they would be subject to a fine if those users put out misinformation on other social media platforms outside of PayPal? They were going to get fined $2,500. Is that what PayPal's told people? If I got that right?
We know that big tech, all these guys work together. Once you get blackballed by one, it's just a matter of time before others come after you too. So, if you're running even a Substack and posting on your Facebook account, Zuckerberg doesn't like it, you can get dinged there, and then LinkedIn is going to go after you, and then who knows? There's then Twitter. and then they start coming after your money, right? And
because this was raising it to a whole new level of punishment.
Yeah, well,
we saw with the Canadian truckers. We saw the same thing.
Yeah, that's right. That's right. And it's not clear. And I think this is fascinating how all this could sort of happen, because since I wrote that article, I've gotten a lot of communications from people who've had their accounts at PayPal deleted over the course of 4 years. So my guess is that when this announcement came out, and actually it wasn't an announcement, it was just a release of a new acceptable use policy.
Right.
And it was more or less a codification of what they were already doing, so they didn't expect any controversy from it. I think, I forget now who, Daily Wire, I guess, or somebody picked it up first. Just going through the AUS, acceptable use
policy,
AUP,
Mm-hmm.
and found this little remark about disinformation, and highlighted it, and then National Review ran with the story, and then the Epoch went with it, and I wrote an article, and it became a big deal. And then it was fascinating because people started deleting their accounts, and we don't know what went on the inside, but my guess is that, people who had held a lot of money there started thinking, wow, we got some real tax farming going on here. I better pull down my money, which might have led to something of a digital bank run. In any case, the stock was hit really hard. And from January to the present, the stock's down about 56%. So there's every indication this was, how should I say, a harmful policy. But what's fascinating, and we can go to chapter 2 here, is that after the dust settled over the course of 24 hours, it turned out that the new acceptable use policy includes a remark that if you are intolerant in ways that lead to discrimination, they can do the same thing to you. So, I don't know. That I said today that seems to me just a rewording of the same policy.
Yeah, absolutely,
so they have every intention of doing this. And, this really speaks to, I think, it's a big problem we have in our time, which is that these private companies, have two clients they're dealing with. One is their customers and stockholders in one hand, so they're like market actors. On the other hand, they got the regulators, and I guess for lack of a better term, it's sort of a ruling class, and they're toggling between both. Their interests don't always line up.
Mm-hmm.
So this is a major problem, and it's a problem for all these companies.
Also,
what struck me is just astonishing. Oh, go ahead, Bill.
Interesting. Thank you. It's also interesting that in California, we have bills that have advanced and been signed by Governor Newsom along the same lines about disinformation or wrong information, saying that doctors who put out things that are considered wrong are going to be attacked by the state government. I mean, there's plenty of disagreement in the field of medicine without getting into the details of the different arguments about COVID-19. There are plenty of disagreements among doctors, and to have a kind of overt political regime in medicine can't be healthy for competitive pressure for the best health treatment.
Right. So the bigger picture is exactly this. I mean, I grew up in a world where censorship was, something that you would never do. The left and the right all agreed on that. We were all against censorship. And it was something that, even growing up, at the height of my education, I thought, I can't believe anybody ever censored anything. I mean, that's just really brutal and primitive. We'll never do that. Well, now, it seems it's so common, and it's not so easy to say, oh, it's a private company, therefore it's not censored. No, these are, well, in some sense, these companies are the digital versions of the public accommodations, whether you recognize the legitimacy of that or not. They are serving, the government in many ways. I mean, we know from our history of the emails of this whole thing when the pandemic broke out, they all signed up and said, "Oh, let us do what we can. Let us block misinformation." Well, you combine that with just the essential nature of these services that we're using, all the dominant market players are now serving the regulators. How far are we away from something like a China's social credit system, where your access to essential services and even your right to to associate or speak or anything else becomes truly, or make a living or keep your money becomes
right.
contingent.
Keep your money. That's what the PayPal thing was about, just simply keeping your money.
Yeah. And, it's fascinating. And by the way, one of the world's great experts on the history of tax farming is on this call. And that's Bill Evers. I mean, he's a world expert on tax farming. But there's not many people who know that much about the subject. Bill does. I've been reading up on it. So back in the ancient world, it's very common for the government not to attempt to collect taxes itself. What it did is it provided sort of bounties. There were lotteries, and you'd say, well, I want to collect taxes. And then you try it out, and you show up back at the palace with a sack of gold, and they flip a few coins in your direction. That's where you make money. But it's a kind of a profession as a tax farmer. After the Enlightenment, this was considered really tremendously brutal because the tactics that the tax farmers would use to collect their taxes for the public good were sometimes unseemly, and so that practice of tax farming went away. But on February 27th, 2020, the New York Times said we really need to go medieval on this coronavirus, and that brought a whole bunch of medieval practices back, and one of which I wonder is a kind of a tax farming now. So you've got private companies dinging you if they disagree with you and taking your money. It feels like taxation.
So they said that you'd get charged $2,500 if you were found to be spreading misinformation. What was misinformation exactly? I mean, it's like saying that there was no Holocaust.
So they never said what misinformation is, and this is, of course, the way authoritarian governments work, right? Mm-hmm. You don't want strict rule of law. That's why liberalism has always celebrated rule of law. So the rules are what they are, and then you comply with them,
right?
And we're all good, right? But if you have a vague rule like no misinformation, now you've got the opportunity to apply it arbitrarily, and you create terror in the population. And this has been going on now for 2 years. You have people all the time on Twitter going, I don't understand it. How come I got banned, whereas this other guy who says things far more outrageous does not get banned? Okay, well, that's the point, right? That's arbitrary enforcement. Mm-hmm. So you really don't know what the rules are. You don't know what the rules are on YouTube. We can get a video taken down and nobody's explaining anything to you. And what it does is it creates a general sort of obsequious attitude towards the state within the population. Like, whatever I'm going to do, I'm going to stay out of trouble. And we see these people, being hurt all the time, and then we're just like, well, fortunately, that didn't happen to me. I better mind my P's and Q's. Right?
Keep my mouth shut on things that the ruling people don't want me to talk about.
That's right. And
my thinking is that with regard to independent institute broadcasts, I better wear a bow tie.
Oh, yeah. Now that we got the bow tie is the new standard. Well,
that's right. You got to have some compliance here. There's another factor here,
dress
too.
Code. Dress code.
Yeah, right. So, Graham, the thing is that in March of this year, the Biden administration released a executive order calling for study and implementation of a central bank digital currency. Mm-hmm. And this is pretty clearly what they regard as being the next round of great monetary reform, right? Which, and everybody's looking at the dollar going, well, that's no good. Look at my groceries keep going up in price. No problem. We've got a solution here. We're going to have a private blockchain system as agreed, run by the federal government, and all the banks are going to be on it, and it enables them to track all of your spending. Whether you're buying a pack of cigarettes at the store or a house, they'll be able to figure it out and correlate that with your tax bills and also your social credit history and notify all the relevant parties. So yeah, it's all very weird. I mean, for all this to be happening at the same time. So therefore, I'm suggesting that maybe this little snafu by PayPal was just a first test to see how the population would react to that. And I'm just glad somebody found it.
Yeah, react.
Have responded to it. The thing is, I get worried, too, when people say, well, that was a great victory. We really beat them down with that. But, well, maybe. But we might have won that battle, but there are many more ahead. And it's not obvious to me who's going to come out on top in this whole thing. And you shouldn't have to have a viral Twitter campaign to get back your money and your free speech rights.
No, you really shouldn't. Yeah, absolutely. Okay, so things are getting a little confusing on that score. I'm glad we have a watchdog with the Brownstone Institute and Jeffrey Tucker, but we all need to be paying attention to these things. A related matter, I'm just changing the subject slightly, but I'm afraid it's more or less the same theme. It's hard not to notice some of these things that Vice President Kamala Harris comes out with publicly, where she seems to be very much a kind of a spokesperson for whatever the reigning thought or doctrinal position is these days. So on September 30th, she was being interviewed about the aftermath of Hurricane Ian in Florida, and they were talking about, funds being given to help those who are trying to recover and so forth. And here's what Vice President Harris said: "It is our lowest income communities and communities of color that are most impacted by these extreme conditions and impacted by issues that are not of their own making. And so we have to address this in a way that is about giving resources based on equity, understanding that we fight for equality, but we also need to fight for equity, understanding not everyone starts out in the same place. And if we want people to be in an equal place, sometimes we have to take into account those disparities." Well, that sounds pretty much like gobbledygook, but when you look at it carefully, there's a common thread there that if you're going to hand out help after the hurricane, some people are going to get it before others so that in the end, everybody can come out equal. Now, this sounds like some kind of a weird racial favoritism to me, isn't it?
Right, it's anti-liberal and against the idea of universal rights. I mean, you make your everything a privilege, and it's all contingent upon identity politics, identitarianism of the left in this case. And the right dabbled with this stuff in the old days. Nowadays, it's the left that's the main practitioner of it. But it's highly divisive and very dangerous.
So it's interesting. Harris's defenders. So I'm speaking here of the New York Times and the Associated Press, and there may have been others that I didn't see, say, no, you misunderstood. This was all part of a large question. She really meant to not say that we'd have race-based hurricane relief. She meant to say that in all government spending relating to anything pertaining to the environment, we should have race-based spending. So it's not just
so it was much worse than it seemed.
It's everything. It's the so-called environmental justice, which means race-based spending with regard to anything that somehow is deemed to be related to the environment. So I'm not really sure that that's a very strong defense of Harris, but it's interesting what the people who are defending her think is a defense.
I know.
The institutionalization of woke ideology has happened at such a ferocious pace. I mean, it just has taken really what seems like just a few years to go from the bowels of the academy to be institutionalized in the military and all the government regulators, and now with all the top investment firms and all the top corporations and so on and so on. It's just a virus, so to speak, that's crawling through every institution, and most Americans are unaware of it. But it's impacting all of our lives in this grim way with these sort of strange public-private partnerships, all designed to sort of contort and distort society so that we don't just have plain old freedom anymore. No, we're all being directed towards some end as designed by the central planners according to their vision, which we may or may not understand. Who cares? Just comply. I mean, this is the way American life is, and I mean, this is all new to me. I guess I vaguely began to understand this was happening maybe 5 years ago or something, but it has swept through the political culture so quickly.
So there's an interesting anomaly here, and that is the yeshiva schools, the Jewish schools in New York City, and also what's happening to Yeshiva University. But let's just concentrate on the schools. So the New York Times front page has a story, and this goes back some weeks, that the New York City school system and New York State are deeming that these Jewish schools don't provide the standard curriculum that public schools do in New York State, but they're getting some government money to educate the kids. So here is a case where you have a particular cultural identity, but instead of celebrating them and saying, oh, they're on some different path, the state, the central planners, as Jeff was saying, are saying, no, conform to some anti-clerical model of life. It's not that the public schools are working very well in New York City. It's not that if you compare across incomes for the many people in these Jewish schools are not well-to-do. There's some poor people in them, poor families. It's not that somehow those kids are doing worse in the Jewish schools than they are in the secularistic public schools. It's just they're different. And this is a group where they don't like the identity and they're stamping it out. So we live in a strange time. You know, the central planners have some different ideas depending on the group that they're making their favorites.
That is really true. And just one quick comment on that. You know, during the pandemic response, this whole sort of thing was challenged because there were many, particularly religious groups in this country that were not going along with it at all.
Right.
Orthodox Jews in New York had nothing to do with it. The Amish said this is dumb. Many break-off Mormon sects said, "Oh, I'm not gonna do this." And then you had the dissenters from the vaccine and so on. Well, after that happened, and of course their disease outcomes were no better or worse than anybody else's, right? So, but after that, you had this movement to just swear this can never happen again. We want one plan for everybody, and the Hasidim in particular are going to be targeted, right, as they were during the pandemic. They're going to be targeted in the future for their whole way of life. For their willingness to comply. It's a very dangerous time for religious minorities.
And the Orthodox or ultra-Orthodox Jews are not trying to educate their children to participate in the regular society and the commercial, industrial. They don't want them to starve to death, but they're trying to educate them to be religious people of good character. And that is their main goal. Now, the city actually did a report that was earlier and quite different from the state report. The city said, hey, they're teaching them math. They're teaching them some English, some history and geography and science and so forth. And they're in general, covering some of the same territory. Also in their Jewish studies, they learn a lot of different skills. It's not just Jewish language or Jewish culture, but there's ancillary aspects of that pertain to general knowledge. So it's not like these kids can't be successful in life, that their parents don't want them to be like, everyday man on the street. They want them to be different, but they don't want them to starve to death. They want them to be able to support themselves. So this is just meddling.
It seems that
I'm sympathetic that people should learn more math and more English. And
well,
stuff
sure,
like that.
Yeah.
But, you know, whose child is it? Is it the parents or is it the government's child?
It seems like in so many of these cases, what we have is that there's the deploying of means of control toward ends that, I guess one could argue about equality or, a certain kind of education or socialization or democratic citizenship capacities and so forth. One could argue about those various ends. But what's really worrisome is that the means necessary to achieve those ends involve a high degree of supervision and control. And people seem to be so quick to overlook the cost of that kind of supervision and of these means to those noble ends. Like, for instance, looking at Kamala Harris's remark about race-based hurricane relief, a lot of people might say, well, yeah, those who are the most worst off, they should get more help than those who are. So it's people might react sort of sympathetically, but then failing to see that to achieve that requires the use of targeting measures and filters and screens that will be incredibly invidious and really onerous. We have to face up to the cost in implementation.
I almost think you're being too kind, Graham.
Well, I try to be.
The veil was ripped off progressivism by the recorded remarks of the left progressive people on the Los Angeles City Council.
Oh, boy. Okay, tell us about that, Bill.
Redistricting. They were discussing gerrymandering. They were discussing where big assets like stadiums and airports and things like that, whose district they would go into so that politicians could be giving out jobs and peddle influence and so forth. They were discussing all this. And suddenly they're engaged in not only, racial bloc maneuvering about what race is going to get what treats and so forth, but they're casting aspersion on people. So these were Latinos, basically, three left-wing city council people and the leader of all labor unions in Los Angeles. And they're using, this is a kind of family program. I don't want to really get into the slurs that were being used, but they were pretty ugly. And they were even, slurring one city council member not in the conversation as homosexual, gay, and they were mocking him. They were mocking his black child and all this ugly, ugly stuff. So underneath this, we're just trying to help various races that have not done as well as they might, is power and manipulation and the lowest form of Machiavellian maneuvering. And this is what we saw when we saw the private language of this. You can see what the private, unexpected to be revealed language of these progressive politicians is in reality.
They're hypocrites, and so maybe a lot of people on the right are hypocrites too.
I'm not saying they're hypocrites. They really believe what they said in this private conversation,
right? And
the rest is just a smokescreen.
Right. Mm-hmm. But what I'm thinking, though, as I'm listening to this, is that it's a form of hypocrisy, and others are hypocritical too. But the real problem isn't so much that these are bad people, although apparently they really are, but that they have at their disposal the ability to dispense goodies and favors. Like, why do these people have the power to do these things in the first place? That's the question in my mind.
For it.
Yeah, because the government has been captured as the dispenser of goods and services and rewards and punishments. If the government wasn't available to do that, then they're bad character. They could be privately bad people, but there wouldn't be the means of misusing it through the power of the state. Good grief!
So it's interesting.
Graham, I totally agree with that. And this is a message that Republicans, if in fact they're going to take. There's going to be a red wave and they take control. But if they don't like these policies, they need to recognize something.
Right.
It's not good enough just to change the policy.
Is that?
Yeah. You have to really start dismantling, and we need to get serious about this. We need to start dismantling the machinery that has been built up around to dispense and advocate for and lobby for this policy and benefit from it. Mm-hmm. There has to be a major effort on to tear apart the administrative state, not just federal level, but at all the states and localities and everything else.
Especially California.
Otherwise the Republicans are just going to squander, as they always have, a chance to make lasting reform.
So it's interesting.
Very well put.
That Liz Truss, who's the new prime minister in Great Britain, has made a modest effort to try to cut back the state. At least she's proclaimed this as her program. And the entire establishment, both business, political, and journalist, has just had a fit. And they've tried to bring down her government and reverse her policies. It's almost unbelievable. A very interesting, saw two very interesting articles. One was the idea that this was in the Wall Street Journal, the idea that there's a kind of a ratchet effect in government. This is the kind of thing that Robert Higgs, who's long been associated with the Independent Institute, has written. And so there's this ratchet effect, and government grows over time, especially in crises and self-proclaimed emergencies. And then if you propose rolling that back, everybody comes down on you. Every politician, every bureaucrat, every company that's been benefiting from the status quo, every journalist who's buying into the ideology of this. And that's what Liz Truss has seen. It's really obnoxious. And, much involves portraying her as if she were some sort of total laissez-faire
monster,
Friedrich Hayek monster.
When she's not monster. Even. I mean, if only she were.
She's more moderate than that. Right. But the point is, she has some Thatcher. She sincerely sees herself, I think, in the tradition of Margaret Thatcher, again, who wasn't perfect, but did try to roll back big government in Britain.
Yep.
And so the program that Jeff is saying that the government needs to take, it's not going to be a bed of roses to try to push this back. It's going to be an arduous struggle.
The television, the British comedy series called Yes Minister, I think was made in written and made in the 1980s. I'm not entirely sure, but 40 years later, it's far worse.
Oh, yeah, exactly.
Right.
So have a look at that. So this is the other thing, something I've been emphasizing recently. One of the problems with Trump when he got into office is he thought he was going to be CEO of the government and the country, and everybody would comply with him, and everything would be fine. He didn't understand the whole machinery out there that he couldn't control that believes themselves, like in Yes Minister, to be the real government, and the elected politicians are just the fake people who show up and for a theater from time to time, and then go away.
The new administration is the Christmas help.
Yeah, that's right. That's the way they look at it. So, here's the thing that these incoming people with the so-called red wave need to be desperately educated. And I don't know, there need to be some programs that set them down and explain to them what's really going on and how the civil service works. How they have the institutional knowledge, what they can expect from the media, which has a very close relationship with the administrative state and big business. They need to be aware of the problems they're going to face and the consequences of taking it on, and then just be urged to tell them that if you want to save civilization, this is what you got to do. Right? I mean, they're going to be our new leadership. All right. Lead us back into the light and out of this emerging darkness as soon as possible. But be aware of what you're faced with.
I think
last subject. Oh, go ahead, Bill. Then we'll turn the page.
All I wanted to say was there's different kinds of Republicans, and I think if you think back to the old Everett Dirksen kind of Republican, and then you think to the Ronald Reagan Goldwater type Republican, and then you think to the Tea Party, which is kind of extra party, but still it's mostly Republicans. And then you think of the Trump people. There's increased awareness of the administrative state. There's increased skepticism of ideological pandering by the news media. So even if they don't have as much experience, the newcomers don't have as much experience as they might, even though they might not have the depth of knowledge that it would be more helpful. They have a pretty good baloney detector that may help them withstand this horrible pressure they're going to be under.
We have a few minutes left. I wanted to just change the subject briefly, especially because we have the pleasure of having Jeff Tucker with us. But this is the time of year when we all should be, I guess, celebrating the conferral of Nobel Prizes, right? So the Nobel Prize in Economics was just awarded. Jeffrey Tucker wrote a piece warning us that actually this is a form of moral hazard was characterizing the Nobel awarding. What did you mean by that, Jeff?
Well, moral hazard is the actions you undertake that actually end up rewarding, thereby encouraging and perpetuating the very thing you're trying to oppose.
Right.
So the idea of moral hazard in this case applies at two levels. On one hand, it was Bernanke who created the impression from his actions back in QE.
So it's a former chair of the Federal Reserve who just got awarded the Nobel Prize, Ben Bernanke. Just FYI.
Right.
Okay.
Right. So Bernanke, undertook this sort of quantitative easing, which was, which is to monetary expansion as social distancing is to force human separation. Right. It's just a euphemism. But the thing is that after 2008, we didn't see a lot of macroeconomic consequences to that credit expansion that he undertook. And it taught a whole generation of central bankers, whatever. I guess we're magic and brilliant after all. We can do this forever. So when 2020 came, the Fed eventually, over the course of 18 months, unleashed $6.3 trillion in hot money on the streets. And now you can't afford to buy beef roast at the store anymore. So, and I guess the second level on which the moral hazard exists is that if you give prizes to people like this, you're only going to perpetuate this kind of bad behavior.
This is how you get rewarded.
Yeah, right. Can I ask you a question? How come they had how come the last, in 2007 to 2009, they flooded the system with money? How come that didn't cause inflation, but now it's causing it now?
Yeah, so this is really a great question, and I think it's really intriguing. It's a simple answer though. In 2007, 2008, they put all the new money in cold storage. They just recapitalized the banks, and Bernanke came up with this great trick where he said to the central bank, "Let's pay higher than a market rate for their deposits, and that way it'll never be unleashed on the streets, and that'll be it." So just sat there in cold storage, and we were watching the effective money supply actually decline weirdly because all the banks were dumping their deposits into central bank, earning the big bucks more so than they would by lending it out. You see what I mean? Very clever. Well, 2020 came along and said, let's do what Bernanke did. Well, they did the first part. They didn't do the second part. Instead, they fired up the helicopters and just dropped the money all over the country. In fact, directly into the bank accounts of businesses and individuals,
right,
much to the shock of virtually everybody, which converted, when money that once was in cold storage to becoming really hot on the streets, driving inflation, as Milton Friedman predicted 8-10 months later. So it was just dumb and outrageous and totally an affirmation of everything that the quantity theory of money said. I mean, it was like clockwork how quickly it all happened. They somehow didn't expect it. They're like, oh no, we got inflation. What do we do? Well, how about let's bring about recession? It's getting pretty grim out there. The failure of the experts is the theme of the age.
I'll say, isn't it though? Wow. Okay, we're going to draw to a close in a minute here, but I want to turn back to Ivan. We began with you talking about the Ukraine crisis, Ivan. Do you have any words of wisdom for our policymakers or predictions for those of us sitting on the sidelines, chewing our fingernails, worrying about this? What do you recommend and what do you foresee over the next few weeks?
Well, I think if we can get out of this with some sort of a settlement, well, of course, it would be good to have a total reevaluation of U.S. policy, given the fact that NATO expansion is a root cause of this, I think, but that we don't have that type of introspection in the United States because we have neoconservatives on the one side and liberal interventionists on the other side, which kind of just, blend into one.
They're all pushing in the same direction.
Go back and we're nationalistic enough that we can never go back and say, like, unless we have a catastrophe like Iraq or, Afghanistan or Vietnam,
right?
When our own soldiers are dying and that sort of thing, then we sort of take stock for a while, like the Vietnam War caused the Vietnam syndrome during the Carter and the Ford and the Carter administration, but then in the Reagan administration, they started ramping up the invasions or interventions again, and then Reagan was at a fair medium level, and then they kicked it up a notch with the first Iraq war during the Bush administration, and then Clinton went to town on a lot of little interventions. We went on. The rest is clear, but so we have these periods where we have a total catastrophe, but it never seems to dawn on us that we really can't afford to do this anymore. Well, what do you have, more than $30 trillion in debt? And, we really need to rethink what we're doing and, perhaps have a big powwow after this is all over and say the great powers, why don't, if we're going to do these, if we're realists, we may each police our own region and call it a day. And even in our own region, we need to be more benevolent than we have been in the past. So we need a strategic. In other words, if you don't want to do that, have a strategic reevaluation, and maybe if Putin gets overthrown or something, then you have an excuse where you could have a more moderate policy toward Russia. But if they throw him out, they're probably going to throw him out with the hardliners and make it worse. So you never know. So the short answer is, I'm not, this is not a good situation, but it is for the Ukrainians, I guess, but the Ukrainian military, not the Ukrainian society, because they're getting their whole country destroyed. So I don't want to say it's good for Ukraine, but certainly it's better for Ukraine that they push the Russians, past their borders. But then but the two countries are going to have to live together. And the United States, I hope they don't. There's some hawks in the U.S. said, well, we should put them into NATO right away. And I'm going, that got us into trouble in the first place. That's one of the reasons that Putin did this, I think. So, it's, I just think our whole foreign policy, we need a global idea. That's what my new book is, or my book that's in the pipeline now on U.S. defense policy says, we really have to evaluate our role in the world and whether we're going to try to fight these two countries at the same time or not fight them, but certainly contain them and that sort of thing. Or should we have a more limited view because of our superior geography and inherently fabulous intrinsic security that we can, maybe let the Europeans and the Japanese and the Australians and some of the other rich countries do some of this policing if it needs to be done.
I predict that if the Republican Party gains one or both houses of Congress in a couple of weeks, that these kind of military strategy discussions might actually become very ripe again. If they don't, the Democratic Party retains its control of all three, both houses and the presidency. I doubt that the kind of considerations that you're talking about, Ivan, will be on the table. But if the Republicans win, they're pretty divided, actually. And there could actually be an interesting discussion.
They are, yes. You have the hawkish Mitt Romney version. Other ones like Rand Paul who are less enthusiastic about it. So but there's also a strain of non-intervention Democrat Party.
Yeah.
And it has been fairly strong, probably stronger than the Republican Party until probably the last 5 or 6 years, when I think the Republican Party has equal to it or
greater.
Or passed it up. So it's not really a partisan issue as much.
Not really, no.
It's the hawks versus the more restrained people.
Right.
I want to raise a couple of red flags here. One is the temptation that may come as atrocities grow by the government in Iran against the people. So, so far the United States has stayed out of that, but the temptation is strong, as Ivan has written. And secondly, the other prong of what Tom Friedman was writing about when he said that the U.S. is fighting Russia and China is that with regard to China, he wasn't just talking about the threats to Taiwan's autonomy. He was talking about the U.S. saying that it would never allow the Chinese semiconductor industry to grow to the skill and proficiency and expertise of the U.S. So we were going to be at war to prevent China from being a success in the semiconductor field. This is a kind of a new expansion of war that's potentially, it's very obscure as to how it's going to play out. But this is a very major declaration by the United States that it's not going to allow success of another country. Very mercantilist, but also...
I have some experience of working at the Pentagon and other agencies with export controls, and it's almost better to, instead of because we had a lot of export controls against the Soviet Union during the Cold War, but the more I got into it, the more I thought, these export controls impede our own industry and our own technological growth, because people interacting with other people and exporting products and stuff naturally increases the technology. So I came to the conclusion when I worked in the government that they ought to just take off most of the controls, except maybe on nuclear stuff or like that, and just try to outcompete the other countries, because I think the U.S., a lot of other countries have a lot more regulations than even we do here. So I think, you might have to guard against industrial espionage because everybody wants to steal your stuff. But that can be a private decision of the company saying, we've got to have good security because we don't, these technologies are our bread and butter. We make money off this. So I think that kind of a system should work. You should just stay ahead of them in the market and not over control it, because these government controls bleed into the private sector and it inhibits our own technological advancement.
Mm-hmm. Well, listen, we've covered a lot of territory today. I think we need to adjourn with thanks to all three of you for your expertise. Especially grateful for Jeffrey Tucker joining us. As a reminder, Jeffrey is with the Brownstone Institute, brownstone.org, I believe, if I've got that right, Jeffrey. Invite you all to visit him there. Also, of course, we always invite you to turn to the Independent Institute. Our website is independent.org. We have a lot of great material, deeply researched, that is available through that website. You can find things from Ivan Eland and from Bill Everson, from many others on our website, independent.org. Any parting shot from you, Jeffrey? Didn't give you a chance for your parting shot a minute ago.
No, except that I will say that these are exceedingly dangerous times, and I always go back to my mentor. I never met him; he died many years before I was old enough to meet him. Ludwig von Mises said, "Every person must throw himself into the intellectual struggle when civilization is sweeping into destruction," and I think that's what all of sincere believers in liberty, human freedom, and human rights need to do today.
Well put. Thanks all of you. Thanks to all of our friends who will be joining us, watching this video. And we'll look for you again in a couple of weeks on Independent Outlook from the Independent Institute here in California. Take care, everybody, and bye-bye.